Catholic Overview of the Bible, the video program 11. This is a map of the Jerusalem that Jesus knew. Herod was completing a grand temple to impress the Jews, though he was not known to be devout or even Jewish, or perhaps half Jewish. The temple was built on a large rectangle on a height in the city, the same mount that Abraham climbed preparing to sacrifice Isaac, the same height that Solomon had built the first glorious temple. The temple itself faced east, that's to the right. Coming down from the southern steps from the temple platform was an elongated area known as the ancient city of David, bordered on both sides by valleys. A deep drop on the eastern side was into the Kidron Valley. A drop on the other was the valley known as Gehenna, where fires burned the city trash. Across the Kidron was the Mount of Olives. City walls, blue under the jurisdiction of Herod, and red jointly with Agrippa, surrounded the city with 6 gates. At the northwest corner of the temple complex was the Roman garrison known as the Antonia. It overlooked the temple court. This picture is taken from the height of the Mount of Olives, where this fellow and his camel stand day by day to take money from the sightseers. At least it was so a few years ago. The platform area of the Temple of Herod is plainly seen with the walls and the subsequent drop into the Kidron Valley. Here we are looking west. However, instead of a Jewish temple, there stands a Muslim mosque called Dome of the Rock, built in the 7th century. This map acquaints us with the areas of the city in Jesus' day. The city of David is the Florida shape extending from the temple to the south, marked number 15. Across the Tyropoeon Valley, which is also called Gehenna, lies the poorer section, marked 20, and further to the west, the wealthy lived, in the higher 20s. At the northwestern corner of the temple sat the great Antonia fortress, marked 36, where soldiers, seeing the Jews about to kill Paul, came down and rescued him. There are other areas of interest. The upper city, the lower city we've already looked at. The Pool of Siloam, number 17. The Mount of Olives, number 11. Here, the ancient city of David is outlined as it extends down from the Temple Mount. The Mosque of the Rock, Muslim, is in the background. An aerial photo from above the Mount of Olives, looking across the Kidron Valley, across the wall, into the Temple Mount. An architect's drawing of Herod's temple, completed during Jesus' life and razed by Rome in 70 A.D. Here are the southern stairs that Jesus and the disciples were familiar with, entrances to more stairs that led up to the court of the Gentiles. The Temple Mount looking from southwest to northeast. This view shows various entryways into the temple. The southern entrance was the most frequently used by commoners. The temple was surrounded by a series of courts. Immediately surrounding the temple was the court of the priests. Smoke can be seen rising from the altar of sacrifice in the court of the priests. The court of the women was a large square court to the east and front of the temple. The large court surrounding the temple and its immediate courts was known as the court of the Gentiles. A balustrade separated the court of the Gentiles from the temple and its surrounding courts. Non-Jews could not pass the balustrade. It was in the court of the Gentiles that money changers and animals were sold. The royal stoa was the taller in color. It is a red-roofed building where the Sanhedrin met. An intricate model is present for tourists to acquaint themselves with first-century Jerusalem. Here is the Temple Mount with the Antonio Fortress at the northwest corner. In the foreground are the pools of Bethsaida, where Jesus healed a man on the Sabbath. From the same model, looking up from the city of David to the southern temple wall and steps. Again, the model looking over the walls into the court of the Gentiles, with the temple standing within the court where only Jews were allowed. The temple of Herod, protected by walls, only allowing Jews within. The court of the Gentiles, the colonnades all around provided meeting places where Jesus would teach and preach. He reminded his judges that they had heard him and knew what he said. Again, on the corner looms the Antonio. On the model, the Roman fortress, the Antonio, looms above the pools of Bethsaida. These southern steps were the general entrance to the temple, where people would meet, then ascend into entrances, which led to further stairs up into the court of the Gentiles. This is not a picture from the model, but the archaeological digs that go on exposing the stairs and other finds. Archaeologists continue to excavate, exposing the massive stones that held up the great construction of the temple and its courts. This inscription warns non-Jews from proceeding into the inner courts, allowed only to Jews, on pain of death. Today, another small mosque, the Mosque of Omar, anchors the southern end of the old temple area. The lower courses of stone were original to the walls of Jerusalem in Jesus' time. Walls from the 6th and 7th century are built on top of them. A section of wall from the temple area still stands on the west. Here pious Jews come to pray and leave prayers to God in the crevices between the blocks. These men wear their prayer shawls and cover their heads. Often there's a rocking motion accompanying their prayers. Archaeology is continual in that old city of David. These people are actually excavating beneath their house in an attempt to recover ancient items. An arm bone and a hand with household remains mark the death of someone during the Roman destruction of 70, or maybe later. And a spear is left behind during some stressful time, of which Jerusalem saw many. In the old city of David, in this room, thought to be the upper room of the Last Supper, however, recovered and rebuilt in much later times, there is an interesting sculpture of a pelican mother feeding babies from the flesh of her breast as a symbol of the Eucharist. This is the room where the Eucharist was first revealed by Jesus, or at least it's in the same site. We have seen this pavement in an earlier slide program, but this is below street level. You have to go down a flight of stairs, and here's the pavement that was the actual one, where people and animals walked, where soldiers were stationed with their horses in Jesus' day. The Roman soldiers drilled into rock this game to play on their off hours. Today, the street level is above that ancient pavement, and the struggle to carry the cross is replayed by devout people on many occasions, but most fervently on Good Friday. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre has areas claimed by many Christian sects, sometimes in less than friendly rivalry. The ornamentation built up over the centuries is startling to modern Western eyes. This altar is built over the actual holes made for the dropping down of the crosses. A pilgrim, by getting down, either lying or stooping, can reach the holes and place petitions in them. Again, the heavy objects of adoration, candles and lamps, silver figures, are overwhelming, but evidence of faith poured out over the ages. The exterior of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is off-putting in its hodgepodge eccentricities, but again is evidence of hundreds of years of existence in many forms, in construction and reconstruction after demolitions. A narrow, low doorway seen here is said to be low to discourage horses from being ridden into the church. Of the 8 gates of Old Jerusalem, this is the Damascus Gate, through which St. Paul set out to imprison Christian believers in that further city. An aerial photo of Damascus taken from the National Geographic magazine. Even with the crease in the magazine pages, the very straight street through the heart of the city is visible, bringing to mind that it was on a street called Straight that St. Paul in Acts 9 stays blind and fasting after his confrontation with the risen Jesus. Even today, in the jumble of streets in Damascus, there is a very straight street. Of the many cities evangelized by Paul, some are only ruins today. This one is in what was then Galatia, but now is Turkey. Rome today is full of magnificent ruins of the time of the apostles. In this city, both Peter and Paul were martyred, the beginning of the martyrdom of thousands who professed Jesus as Lord because of their preaching and witness. Here among these ruins of a dead religion and culture, the dome of St. Peter's Basilica witnesses to true faith in the eternal God. A famous painting by Michelangelo of the crucifixion in Rome on Vatican Hill in 64 AD of St. Peter, who, refusing to be crucified the same as his Lord, was crucified upside down. South of Rome at Naples are the ruins of Pompeii, destroyed in 79 AD by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. Saints Peter and Paul had been martyred just 14 years earlier. This city was covered with suffocating ash that preserved its last moments, so that we are able to see today life as it was then, within the early years of the spread of the gospel. The next slides are only a few of the hundreds available on Google Images. The first is curious. Can that be the mark of a crucifix that once hung on the wall over this chest? What do you think? It certainly looks like it. Necessities that we take for granted in modern life, we recognize as being necessities then. This young couple, alive at the time of the early apostles, had a mosaic made of their wedding, permanent for the ages, on the wall of their home. The poor were at least 3 times in number than the rich. They were to be pitied, but not the rich, who had villas like this one, with slaves enough to maintain every inch. Antioch was the first successful church established beyond Jerusalem on the coast in the northeastern corner of the Mediterranean in what is now Syria. Thriving in its day and an engine of evangelization, the city no longer exists and is marked only by ruins. It is where the converts to Jesus were first called Christians. This famous pass through the mountains west of Tarsus saw Paul and his companions passing often. This is a Christian village in Syria which the National Geographic presented for Easter significance. Over all the centuries, a village like this continues its Christian observance in the midst of Islam. Recently, that's in 2013, in the Syrian civil war, the Al-Qaeda raided this village, and it's uncertain what happened to many of those Christian people. They were alive and well when the National Geographic was there, and here a Syrian Christian woman prepares for the Easter dinner. These strange rock formations in central Turkey, which was at that time Cappadocia, have been made into hotels these days, but very early they served as hermitages for monks. Though St. Paul may not have reached central Turkey, the gospel reached there in early centuries. Paul's travels down from Macedonia through Greece to Athens and into the lower peninsula known as Achaia are the black line on this map. Corinth is across the isthmus where Paul spent 3.5 years forming a Christian community. At least 2, probably 3 letters were written to this church as they struggled to become truly Christian. On his way, he visited Athens, where the Acropolis surely was as astounding to him as it is to us today. Below the Acropolis on the north is a gathering place called the Areopagus, where philosophers would come to declaim and argue. Paul, taking a cue from a monument to the unknown God, attempted to present Jesus, God's Son, to those who gathered there. Quote, "Now what you worship is something unknown. I am going to proclaim to you, the God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth and does not live in temples built by hands." End of quote from Acts 17. He was not taken seriously except by a few. Another view of the Areopagus, where the bronze tablet on the next slide will testify to his sermon preached there. This is the sermon, written in Greek, that Paul gave to those in the Areopagus. Corinth, where Paul would spend 3.5 years, was a strategic spot for commerce. It was built on a narrow isthmus between the Achaia Peninsula and the Greek Peninsula. To traverse the narrow isthmus cut off many miles of sea travel, so ships on the western side of the isthmus unloaded cargo to be pulled overland to the other side, where it was reloaded on ships traveling east. In the 19th century, this labor was corrected by building a canal. First attempted in the 1st century AD, it was not built until the late 1890s. Another view of the rock that was excavated to construct the canal. Walking the streets of Corinth today, the town where St. Paul spent years was a great commercial city because its location for trade. It's still possible to walk the very pavements he also walked. Paul knew these columns They held up the temple of Jupiter in his day. One of the difficulties Paul and his co-workers in Christ had in Corinth was the proximity of the large temple to Aphrodite on the summit of the hills outside of the city, an ever-present enticement to immorality. It had 1,000 cult prostitutes in service of the goddess. Other temples, or remnants of them, were to Apollo, Poseidon, Hermes, Asclepius, Hygeia. Isthmian games were also held on the isthmus. Corinth became the capital of the Roman province of Achaia. In Roman Corinth, old temples were restored and enlarged, new shops and markets built, new water supplies developed, many public buildings added, including 3 governmental buildings and an amphitheater seating over 14,000. In the 1st century, Corinth's public marketplace was larger than any in Rome. By 50 A.D., when Paul visited Corinth, it was the most beautiful, modern, and industrious city of its size in Greece. The very name Corinth was synonymous with debauchery, and there was one source of evil in the city which was known all over the civilized world. Above the isthmus towered the hill of the Acropolis, and on it stood the great temple of Aphrodite, the goddess of love. To that temple were attached 1,000 priestesses who were sacred prostitutes. The other great Roman city where Paul spent the longest time was Ephesus. Located in ancient times on an important port on the Aegean Sea, gradually the port silted over and trade and prosperity diminished, especially during the epidemics of malaria spread by the mosquitoes of the ensuing marshes. Finally, then, that great city was devastated by an earthquake and abandoned. Ephesus' greatest claim to fame was its temple to the goddess Artemis, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It was almost 4 times larger than the Parthenon in Athens. The Apostle Paul preached in Ephesus, prompting a riot led by silversmiths who crafted shrines to the goddess and feared for both their livelihoods and the future of the temple. The goddess Artemis, whose huge temple exceeded the size of the Parthenon, had silver statues for sale. Once thought to be breasts as her ornaments, these forms were later decided to be testicles. The city had an efficient water and sewer system. Many shops, businesses, streets, and thoroughfares still speak of the life that went on there because, unlike other ancient cities, nothing further has been built over the ruins after its abandonment. We may still walk the pavements that St. Paul and later St. John and St. Mary walked before 100 A.D. Another view. Roman statuary once adorned a building. The wide way down to the Library of Celsus was lined with shops and also a public toilet. Because Mother Mary was given to St. John as mother to son, and he became Bishop of Ephesus after Paul, a traditional site has been the House of Mary on this hillside. Pope Benedict XVI said a Mass in this house. Mary's house is a stop for tourists. We leave Ephesus after marveling at this Library of Celsus that held thousands of scrolls. We approach Rome. This is the Appian Way. Travelers from the south used this road, and undoubtedly St. Paul, probably St. Peter, traveled it. The Emperor Nero, who martyred both Saints Paul and Peter, a licentious man of extreme cruelty and depravity. A type of Roman building that may have been the house prison of Paul for many years as he awaited trial. He was allowed visitors and spread the gospel everywhere, whether bound or free. The Mamertine prison where Paul may have been held, other Christians certainly were. They were lowered down into the darkness through a hole in the ceiling. Today, an altar is prepared for Mass in this space. Clearly the most well-known site of martyrdom by Rome of early Christians is the infamous Colosseum, where uncounted Christians were fed to animals. The insert picture depicts one of those excruciating scenes. We view again Michelangelo's famous painting of St. Peter's Crucifixion by Nero. Recent excavations under the Basilica of St. Peter in Rome has recovered the site of Peter's burial there on Vatican Hill. Successive churches were built over this important grave until the present huge basilica was built in the 100 years between 1500 and 1600. Another view of this ancient tomb, honored by generations of Catholic Christians by continuous construction over the site until the present immense and beautiful basilica. St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Rome destroyed Jerusalem and razed the city and the temple in 70 A.D. Even as prophesied by Jesus, not one stone will be left upon another. Here the Romans celebrate their victory by carrying off the sacred menorah. Pictures for this video program are from Google Images, Doubleday's New Atlas of the Bible, Holy Views Incorporated, Israel, a picture book to remember her by, Reader's Digest, Great People of the Bible, Rogerson's Atlas of the Bible, The New Testament in Living Pictures, Biblical Archaeology Review, and Robert Cross.